As you know from his biography in the conference program, Professor Olivas is currently the William B. Bates Distinguished Chair in Law at the University of Houston Law Center and is the director of the Institute for Higher Education Law and Governments at the University of Houston. Professor Olivas, as many of you know in this room, has led a remarkably successful career for 4 decades in academia, and today is one of the leading legal scholars in immigration and education. You'll see in the program Michael Olivas's past academic training. He's held both a PhD from Ohio State University and a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center, and has held important leadership positions in both of these degree programs. He's also held various prestigious visiting positions at institutions across the country. And he's also been appointed and or elected to some of the most prestigious organizations in law and education. Many of them are listed in your bios in the program, among them the American Bar Foundation, the American Association of University Professors, and others. One, I think, notable distinction that Professor Olivas has received is that he's been elected to membership in the American Law Institute and the National Academy of Education. And he's the only person to have been selected to these both honor academies. And so that is, I think, one example that speaks to the scholar and the impact that he has. And so there's many other honors and accolades that are in his bio, but one thing that I wanted to speak to for just a moment, I won't do a winded introduction, but I wanted to call attention to some of what is not in the bio. And for me, what is missing is what Professor Olivas gives back to communities and gives back to the legal and both education professions and academic training. He's had substantial and varied legal consulting practice, including representing faculty, staff, institutions, and state clients, serving as an expert witness in federal and state courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, circuit courts of appeals, and federal district courts. Professor Olivas has served on the editorial board of more than 20 scholarly journals, served as a trustee on the College Board, and a trustee of the Access Group, Inc., which is the major provider of loans for law and graduate students in the U.S. and in Canada. Recently, Professor Olivas has been president and then past president of the Association of American Law Schools, and for over a decade, he has committed his service to serve on the board of directors for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF. So how is it possible that to be as productive as Michael Olivas has in terms of his scholarship, considering just the service that he has given alone to these organizations and to communities? And so he's authored or co-authored over 15 books since 1979. Some of those that have been particularly influential for those of us who do this work, for me in education, have been Latino College Students in 1986, Colored Men and Hombres Aquí, Hernandez v. Texas and the Emergence of Mexican-American Lawyering in 2006, Education Law Stories that I use in one of my courses in 2007, and No Undocumented Child Left Behind in 2012, which tells the story of the Plyer v. Doe Supreme Court landmark case. Now, his most recent published book last year in 2013 is called Suing Alma Mater, documents key issues in higher education law through the review of more than 120 college cases that have been brought before the Supreme Court in the past 50 years. And these are only his books. He's authored over 100 journal articles and book chapters in both the law and in the social sciences. And for these vast and significant contributions, he's been recognized by organizations like the American Educational Research Association, AERA, the Association for the Study of Higher Education, ASH, and a few notable recognitions, I think, are receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from MALDEF and from the Hispanic Bar Association of Houston. Most recently, in this year, he is the winner of the Stephen S. Goldberg Award for Distinguished Scholarship in Education Law for his most recent book, The Suing Alma Mater. So in all the free time that Professor Olivas must have, he hosts a regular show. That was sarcastic, by the way. He hosts a regular show on Albuquerque, New Mexico, NPR radio station KANW called The Law of Rock and Roll, where he reviews legal developments in music and entertainment law, appearing as the rock and roll law professor. So Professor Olivas is clearly a trailblazer in his field. He was one of the first scholars to begin researching and writing about undocumented students, particularly college students, back in the 1990s. So for decades, he's been doing this work before the research on undocumented students really exploded in recent years. When you read his work, for me, what becomes clear is that Professor Michael Olivas is also a truly gifted storyteller. In his 1990 article titled "The Chronicles, My Grandfather's Stories in Immigration History," Olivas opens this piece by saying, "The funny thing about stories is everybody has one." And indeed, he tells them well. There are countless and significant legal stories Professor Olivas has told, particularly those relevant to Latinas and Latinos in the US, that teach us about race, rights, law, resistance, and resilience of Latino communities. Now, what you should also know about Professor Olivas that is not in the bio is that he also somehow finds time to support and cultivate the work of students, of junior scholars, and of colleagues. He oversees the Institute of Higher Education Law and Governance at the University of Houston Law Center that provides first an invaluable resource of cases, recent policies, legislative news, casebook news, and Professor Olivas' what he calls, quote, private thoughts publicly available, that are these extremely useful, almost seemingly up-to-the-minute analyses of issues related to higher education and the law. And in addition, the center also offers the Houston Higher Education Law Roundtable annually as an annual event. That is an intensive seminar for junior faculty who teach and research broadly in higher education and the law and policy to present their work and be provided guidance from a group of 3 senior faculty with expertise in this area. So what amazing opportunity he provides a group of scholars every year to have this opportunity to move forward their own work. So I'll end this introduction with a personal story about Michael. I think that illustrates this in my interactions with him. So back in 2007, I had co-published my first article in the Nevada Law Review on the experiences of undocumented Latino students. And so I'm a second, third year graduate student, and I'm hoping that someone out there reads this article. And lo and behold, as a few months after it's published, I get an email from Professor Michael Olivas. And so I'm not sure what this is, if I somehow got it through some listserv, because it couldn't be to me directly. And it's this beautiful message about how he read this article, he was congratulating me on doing this work, and sent a list of, I don't know, probably about 20 sources that I could read that would further help me develop my thinking around this area. Now, fast forward to AERA a few months ago, I saw very embarrassingly last minute that Professor Olivas was going to be at this conference, which is our big education conference. And I sent him a very last-minute email to see if there was any way that I could meet with him at this conference, because I thought it would be an amazing opportunity just to talk to him about some of my ideas around race and education and immigration. And so he sent me multiple emails trying to figure out how he could fit me into all of his meetings and speeches and lectures throughout the day. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to make them because I was only there for a short amount of time. And because of that kind of back and forth, I figured, okay, we're going to come back and I'll probably never hear from him again. But what happened was when I returned home, he actually emailed me and said, I know that we weren't able to meet at the conference, but here's my number, call me and we'll figure out a time to talk. And so I called Professor Olivas, and he spent an hour with me talking on the phone about my ideas, about my paper, to a stranger, right, he has never met before. And so I think that that is just one example of the way that he supports students. Now, fast forward to working on the report for this conference, there was a technicality about DACA, the policy. I'm an educational researcher, so the legal language I'm still trying to learn in the work that I do. And there was a question I wasn't sure how to find the answer to in the interpretation of the policy. But I know who would, and I said, you know who would know this? Of course, Michael Olivas. And so I was a little hesitant to email him, though, because of all the communication that we've had regarding the conference logistics these past couple of months. But I also really didn't want to be wrong when I wrote about this in the brief that you all have and the report you all have. So I decided to send him a quick email just to say, you can just tell me yes or no, if not a long answer. He said, okay, no, here's why, I'll send you more sources later. And about an hour later, he sent me a list of about 10 sources of articles and emails that confirmed his no answer. And so I know that my emails and my requests requests to talk with Michael are only one of many, many, many other people who say, I know who could know this answer, Michael Olivas, right? And so I think this is only one story of what I'm sure are also many, many stories of the kind and supportive person that Michael Olivas is, aside from his amazing scholarship and service to the community. So with that, I'm honored to introduce our keynote lunch speaker for today, Professor Michael A. Olivas.
That does it. I'm charging more next time. Carlos, you want me to do this a third time? You're going to ante up next time. Thank you, Lindsay. You did a much better job than Dean Moran ever would have. I'm quite sure of that, as accomplished as she is. Thank you very much, Professor Pérez Huber, Dr. Aro, Dean Moran, and the entire village that brought me here. I haven't seen some of you for a long time, so you may be wondering why I'm carrying a cane. It's because I'm scheduled to have some knee surgery. It's very painful, but I am taking the pain like a man, badly, with whining and crying, mostly. Yesterday when I spoke with a group of doctoral students, Professor Silvio Hurtado, who at my instigation just bought a house in Santa Fe, my hometown, so I'm picking up some real estate plebe as well, said, what is it you're proudest of? And I said, I'm proudest that I've been married for 30 years to Dr. Agustina Reyes, who's here with me today, and also known as the long-suffering Agustina. I also wish to acknowledge my beloved brother, Dr. Richard Olivas, who's here, who is a UCLA doctoral graduate who teaches at West LA College in the history department. Richard, thank you for being here. And my favorite cuñada, his wife, Marian Olivas, who works for the University Senate here on campus. And so returning here is old home week in many respects. What I'd like to do very quickly in the time remaining is to share with you a couple of ideas about the developing law of DACA and undocumented students. I know a couple of you were at the lunch talk I gave yesterday. I recognize a couple of you who slept all through yesterday's talk after lunch. So if you wake up, you've got to at least laugh if I make the same jokes. And I'm confident that I will make exactly the same ones. Maybe I'll have better luck today than I had yesterday. The law students are really tough on me. There have been, in the last 10 years, more than 30 cases involving undocumented college students, or more recently, DACA students, who of course are no longer undocumented. These fall into several different kinds of categories, including direct challenges to DACA, because even the employees at the immigration or the citizenship services are saying they don't like this program. It's taken away their discretion mostly to say no to the undocumented. And as a result, they are suing, and they lost at the trial level, but they are back in the Fifth Circuit now. And I'm confident that we will win this particular case, but there have been several challenges, and so DACA is going to be difficult to undo. But at some point, whatever has been given by the government can also be taken away by the government. So I simply remind you of that this is a government-given discretionary project. And just to throw in one small rock and roll reference, the very first example of deferred action was by my beloved John Lennon, who sued back in the 1970s for deferred action and actually won it. He and his then wife, Yoko Ono, were in the United States, even though he had a hashish hit on his record. He wanted to stay here because Yoko's husband had absconded with their child. and she had legal custody of the child, and so they came and looked, and they wanted to stay in the United States, and President Nixon wanted to remove him because he was afraid that he might lead the youth to rebel against the war. Well, he needn't have worried. He was mostly doing marijuana and sleeping in a bed in Canada much of that time, but there was that fear. And he wins this case and then is allowed to stay in the United States, where, regrettably, of course, he's murdered years after. So there is deferred action. I'm going to come back to that. More troubling has been some challenges to U.S. citizen children whose parents are undocumented. And while most in California don't know this, the original case in this area was a case here in California that the state later settled, making all financial aid for U.S. citizen children, whether or not their parents were undocumented, to be required if they were otherwise eligible. But there have been 3 other such cases that have arisen, including one recently that MALDEF has filed against in South Carolina, a case Rocha Herrera, where they have said U.S. citizen children whose parents are undocumented might very well be removed from the United States, and therefore their financial aid and in-state residence is contingent. Well, the truth is that we've been deporting 400,000 people a year for almost 6 years now, the largest number in history, or at least since Operation Wetback in the beginning of the 1950s. And every year we deport about 10,000 or more citizen children whose parents are undocumented, because until you're 18, your domicile is that of your parents. And so when your parents are removed, you're removed. And so they can represent themselves, of course, when they're 18 and come back in, but they will have lost time. But tens of thousands of people. So in addition to being U.S. citizens who might be deported, which you wouldn't think would happen, this actually does happen quite regularly. Now, there have been 21 challenges as of yesterday. I haven't checked my emails this morning, but chances are there's a new one. There's a new one in California, a challenge to AB 540 students who got financial aid under the new state law. This case, DeVries versus Regents, is going to be, I think, a winner, and we are going to likely, when I say we, I mean here, the University of California, it's like you're going to win this case. But the fact is that for every step forward, there's a step back, and it requires lawyers in many instances, not just organizing, but actual lawyers going to court to defend these particular issues. There have been 4 cases concerning DACA and driver's licenses, and Rachel mentioned how difficult it was for Sergio Garcia, not to be confused, by the way, with the Spanish golfer Sergio Garcia, the one who's dating Martina Hingis, which will help you men in the room remember. It turns out that he wasn't able to get a driver's license in California because the Californians, undocumented Californians, could not get driver's licenses until recently. I might add, in my home state of New Mexico, one of 3 states at the time that allowed the undocumented to get it, our governor has been fighting. When I say our, I mean New Mexico's governor. She's actually a Tejana, who's a Republican, but she's Mexican-American, and she has led the charge now, has made it, in fact, her major issue in a campaign is removing driver's licenses from the undocumented. So there have been those cases. And then there, of course, have been the employment-related cases that Rachel talked about with Samperio, with Varga, and with Sergio Garcia. One distinction that I would add to, over and above her wonderful display of erudition in this area, is that Florida does not allow the undocumented, only DACA members, to become lawyers. And so California is, in fact, the only state, and it has not given full licensure to him. The federal government will not recognize him in any immigration tribunal. And so it's not entirely clear to me how he's going to represent immigration clients if he can't try a case in the BIA or one of the other, BALCA, or one of the other various tribunals. In addition, hanging up a shingle in California is not considered employment. You're not eligible for unemployment, for workman's comp, or any of the other areas. And so there's a long line of cases, having nothing to do with immigration that say that being a lawyer in California, unless you work for a firm, if you're on your own or in a partnership, you do not have employment. You may have a position and you can draw a paycheck and so forth, but it's not employment in the sense that he would require employment authorization because he doesn't have it. By the way, you might be asking yourself, why was he ineligible for DACA? Well, because he aged out. As you know, some people are too young, and then some people are too old for DACA, and he is one of the ones who is too old. I hope you also caught that he's been in line for almost 20 years now, going on 20 years, even though his father's a citizen, to bring him here in large part because he's from Mexico and because those backlogs are so long that it can take 2.5 decades to actually clear, even with permission. So he wasn't really undocumented in the traditional sense of someone who simply had entered without inspection. He is someone who has some status, who probably would never have been deported anyway, unless he tries to go to immigration court, in which case, hasta pa acá juzgado. Now there has been a case that I'm proud to say Malda filed just recently, unfortunately it was necessary, a case Juarez versus Northwestern Mutual, because Northwestern Mutual, the insurance company, will not hire students with employment authorization. They say, well, yeah, it's true they've got employment authorization, but it only lasts for 2 years, and we want our people to be with us longer than 2 years. Well, fair enough, but employment authorization is employment authorization, and I'm going to be paying me attorney's fees really quite soon in that regard. Which is going to be a good thing because with Governor Brewer not running for re-election, I can't get any more out of Arizona. I've done pretty well down there. Let me just say, we've beaten her on virtually every issue. We haven't been able to find any of those headless bodies in the desert that she keeps saying are down there. So I don't expect to collect forensic fees or anything. But there's 30 plus cases going on in the last 10 years having to do with the undocumented. You'd think that we have nothing to do better than litigate, but each one of these has been a particular state, a particular benefit, a particular status, a particular issue that's required one of the usual suspects. If it wasn't Malda, if it was Latino Justice, or it was the National Immigrant Law Center, or it was ACLU, or the Southern Poverty Law Center, you know, all of those of us engaged in this form of general litigation on behalf of progressive immigrant rights. Now here's really the bottom line, and what I'd like you to take away from this, and I'd be glad to answer questions that you might have. It's just your luck. I can stick around and answer questions because I'm not catching a cab like the dean was just a moment ago. I got a flight tomorrow morning, so I can stay here for a long time. First, notwithstanding Plyler, which celebrated its 30th anniversary 2 years ago, and which has proven much more resilient than any of us ever anticipated it would, there's not been very many direct attacks on it, except there have been relentless nativist and restrictionist attacks on immigrants who've been here, even those who've been here a long period of time, much less those who've been here a short time or who are presenting credentials to try and come here now, like these sojourner unaccompanied children. Some steps have been forward, and I've shared some of those with you, and some have been backwards, and I've shared some of those with you. Just last week in Alabama, litigants filed a consent decree with the state to try and accommodate Plyler children, because Alabama lost a case where it said we passed a law that said all immigrant children and their parents have to register their presence in the law school, in schools, so that we can serve them better. We want to provide English language learning to them, so we just need to know where they are. Of course, they didn't repeal truancy laws. These kids were required by law to be there. And not one of those parents who brought those kids there had come simply because they thought Alabama would be a great place to live. I've been to Alabama. Couldn't sell me that. They went there because U.S. citizens and employers brought those parents there to do work. That's why they came. And they stayed because they had families, including citizen children families, And so when we ask ourselves, how does this happen? It's not because the border has collapsed. We don't want to enforce the border. We've never really wanted to enforce the border. We've always left enough space in between and created enough fluidity along the frontera to allow people to come here so that our people could pick the pickles in Alabama and the cherries in Michigan and the tomatoes in Ohio and elsewhere. If they really wanted to keep us out, they wouldn't allow us to do so. And instead, we have millions of people who come here. Of course, as you know, many of them are actual Pakistanis passing themselves off as Mexicans. The way you could tell them is because they have little bottles of Ebola with them. These young children who are just so smart. But the narrative has shifted. And the narrative has shifted because Plyler children are allowed to stay, because most states have made their peace with Plyler after 30 years. They find that these children are, in many instances, high achieving, who interact and whose families interact with their children, and they meet genuine needs and they serve in the community. They're more law-abiding than most U.S. citizens are because they understand the consequences of lawlessness and their removal. But just as the Supreme Court said, we will allow these children to stay here because they are innocent children, this discourse has had two unfortunate effects. One is that it's demonized the parents. If you have innocent children, you've got to have someone who's guilty, and who's that going to be? It's going to be their parents, who are farther away from comprehensive immigration reform than have ever been at this time. And so demonizing parents has been a part of the discourse, because to talk about innocent children requires lawbreakers. They're synchronous with each other. And I confess that this has been a useful discourse. It has gotten us DACA. President Obama announced it on the 30th anniversary of Plyler versus Doe. Speaking of innocent children, now of course these children have now aged to be 18 and therefore should, as you know, self-deport. Should, as you know, self-deport. I can stay up here all day. In addition, the blowback has been that it has stalled comprehensive immigration reform, in my view. No matter how cute these kids are, no matter how likely they are to be Pakistanis hiding as Mexicans, the unaccompanied children who present themselves today are being turned away or being warehoused, in many instances being sexually assaulted and not educated, in warehouses, including, I regret and embarrassed to say, in southern New Mexico, where we've already had plane loads of kids returned to Honduras and other places from which they come, even though these children in many instances had either VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, or Special Immigrant Juvenile options, or asylum or refugee options, because they had reasonable, well-founded fear of persecution in their home countries. And to return them violates not only immigration law, but international treaty law, to which we've been signatories for many years, where you're not supposed to return someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution into an area where they might be. Now, years ago, I had a client who was accidentally sent back because his last name was Lopez, and Lopez is sort of like Smith. And he was sent back accidentally to Guatemala because there was another Jose Lopez. I'm not telling you his exact name for reasons that you'll understand. But after 2 weeks, when we couldn't find him, we realized he was on a list, in part because, as you know, many Latinos have last names, and depending on whether I use the last name or the mother's name can make a difference. And so my client, Jose Lopez Martinez, was sent back to Guatemala, and then the government argued that because he'd been there for 2 weeks and hadn't been killed, that he didn't have a reasonable fear of persecution in Guatemala. Never mind, of course, that the junta at the time and the guerrillas who had gone through his hometown in the mountains, having killed his father, having coerced his older brother into the guerrilla group, and had put out a picture of him on a flyer saying, "We want him," that wasn't considered a well-founded fear. And eventually he was allowed to stay in the United States, in large part because they were embarrassed by their error of having sent back the wrong Jose Lopez. But this is the kind of long haul that you have to be in for this, and that's why I say several steps forward and several backwards. Moreover, this issue of the U.S. citizen children is such that these are cases that were really resolved in the 1890s with pigtail ordinances, the Chinese exclusion cases, and a citizen child is a citizen child. A U.S.-born citizen has no asterisks on them, unless they're the children of diplomats, which of course is not the case here. And so it is well-established law that U.S. citizens, even if their parents should be undocumented, especially once the child is 18, as all college students are, or virtually all of them are U.S. citizens, and they should be entitled to these, and we shouldn't have to go to court and use up precious resources to sue South Carolina and California and New Jersey, which is still not settled on this matter, and Florida, who did finally give in. Here's the final point, and I'll be glad to answer questions people might have. And I'm cutting out a whole swath of this because just of time consideration and because I didn't get any dessert. And I feel my blood sugar dropping. What this proves to me is that our work is not done. We cannot rest upon temporary victories. It's wonderful that you can now borrow money if you're undocumented or a DACA student in California. That's great. Welcome to the U.S. economy where you can borrow money and get in the hole. Okay, that's great. If it helps you go to college, I think that's a wonderful thing. You now can drive. You can now be employed. You can get Social Security numbers. You can leave the country and come back. But if you do, don't be like this guy from Harvard who asked to go back and have advanced parole to return, didn't get it in timely fashion, then went anyway, and then somehow seems shocked when he tries to come back in, they won't let him in. What kind of bendaha is this? We have got to abide by the rules. People who are in DACA are very contingent. This could be lost. This category is entirely discretionary, and if the government gives, the government can take away. And it is ridiculous to go, I understand his mother is ill. I truly understand that. I lost my mother, Richard and I lost our mother when we were in high school. I understand what it's like to lose a mother. But you don't leave the country and come back and then expect that simply your good looks or the fact that you're going to Harvard is going to get you back into the country. It is not. There are any number of our students who got DACA who decided that the marijuana party was just too good a weekend to pass up. And now they find themselves ineligible for DACA renewal. And then they show up on my doorstep and say, "Professor, I'm so sorry. I know you told me not to do drugs and I didn't listen. Can you represent me?" And I say, "No, I don't represent you in California. I don't even practice in California. Go. It's like the nephew of mine who wanted to use tuition money for bail on his fourth DWI. No, sorry, son, you don't get to use that. That's what we got a dad for. Go talk to him." Let me just tell you, in my family, that line would kill. If this were a Olivas family reunion, that line would kill. This is why we need our organizations. We need our MALDEFs. If we didn't exist, we'd have to invent a group like this to go up and to litigate in harsh areas, to put money down in advance, whether or not we're going to win or lose. We spent over $1 million challenging the school finance system in Colorado, only to lose at the last step and no attorney's fees because we lost. Not only did we lose, the Latino children and all the children in Colorado lost because it is an inequitable program, even if it is technically legal. You need us to keep pushing the frontiers, just like you need Latino justice and NILC and the ACLU and these other groups that take on this. Now, I'm not saying you got to agree with us all the time, but if we don't take up these cases, who is going to do so? When Governor Brewer says, well, it's true that in-state tuition is available for deferred action recipients in my state, but DACA is not deferred action. Governors don't get to make that determination. We don't leave immigration determination to governors. And now you know why. She will end up paying us. Thank you very much, Governor Brewer. I wish you weren't leaving office. Don't let the door slam you on the way out. So we'll go after driver's licenses in that state, as we're doing now. She has said, well, it's true that deferred action entitles people to driver's license, but this is contingent. We don't want to give driver's licenses, only to have to take them back. As if they've never heard of expiration dates on driver's licenses or the like. You think in Arizona, with smart people and lawyers, they could have come up with a better solution. So what's the bottom line? We are winning this war. We're winning this war in court, if that's one measure of it. But where we're losing this is on the nightly news. And every time an Ebola case is announced, I cringe because of the way that that's going to treat Africans. There are 2 colleges that now won't let West Africans in who've been admitted. Polish up the attorney's fees, because these folks, as long as they can come in and they are not carrying diseases, they are among us and they are entitled to be here. And this is a discourse. If you go on certain, shall we say, television networks and listen, you would think that these 50,000 children, a very small number given how many there are in the world, these kids are not only lawless, but they're hordes poised at the border, ready to import terrorism the same way that our president was by being born in Hawaii all those years ago, when, as all of us really know, he was born where? In Kenya, in Indonesia, anywhere other than the 49th state. And there are people who in their hearts believe this, truly. And he's got records to prove it. What about these poor kids who ride the train up, resisting all criminal and sexual assaults on the way up here in La Bestia, to get here with no papers at all to present their case, where the best they can say is, well, why are you here with the translator from the government? Porque la guerra. That's not going to do it. But you give the narrative that is true, and these kids have a shot at it. And we are, in fact, trying to remove them as fast as they come. And so the innocent narrative sojourner discourse is gone. It may work for kids who are here for a little while, but to do so, they have to have effected an illegal entry. They have to be entered without inspection. And of course, that means that their parents are at risk. And so here's the final thing, and I say this to all the dreamers in here. Quit getting arrested in McCain's office. Por pendejo. You don't do this. You don't draw attention. You think that being on Facebook means that you are the only person who can read it? You've already let 100 people as your friends, including your friend, the Immigration Services, read that. And they know most of you live with your families. You think they can't find you? You think they can't remove you and your parents and your older brothers and your younger sisters who don't qualify? And finally, for those people who fear DACA, go out and get them signed up for DACA while you can. There are people who, if you go on YouTube, you can find people encouraging you not to sign up because it's too invasive. Well, you think DACA's invasive. Wait till you see deportation. Wait until you see comprehensive immigration reform, where they're going to want to know a lot more than that. You guys give away more information than that on Facebook every morning, telling us what your latte was like at Starbucks. 2 steps forward, 1 back. That is a sign of progress, to be sure. We need to be making more steps forward and fewer back, and not contributing to our own demise. All of you who are DACA students right now, or who are undocumented, your job is to do well in school. That is your job. It's not to go get arrested in McCain's office, because McCain, and here's the secret, please turn off the cameras. He doesn't care if you get arrested and deported. He doesn't. We need you here. We need you in law school. We need you in English departments. We need you in education departments. We need you in sociology departments. We need you here. We need you here as community activists, as parents, bringing up U.S. citizen children. And there are many people who have fought a long time to help you. Your job right now is to stay in school and to do well and not to go out and keep drawing public attention to yourselves. Now, last time I said this on a phone call with some dreamers, they said, you know, Olivas, I know you've been at this a long time, and I know in my heart you're a good guy, despite all this evidence to the contrary. But you're old? Okay, yeah, all right, I'm old. And you're a U.S. citizen. Well, guilty as charged. Yes, I'm a U.S. birthright citizen, which enables me to go to court for you. In any kind of court, not just the courts that the federal government will let Sergio Garcia go into. We need you, and you've got jobs to do, and you've got to let us do our jobs and help us and do the research and let us hold you up as the exemplar, so when it does finally come time for the votes for the DREAM Act, as it will at some point, we could point to you and say, these are our community members, these are our children, please let them in. Thank you all very much. I appreciate the attention that you've given me. I'd be glad to take a couple of questions from people. Once again, I've answered every single person's question in this room. Yes?
I find it very difficult to actually convince some students to apply for DACA. So is there anything you recommend?
Yeah, tell them how bad it is in Honduras. Tell them if they don't like it here, go back to Mexico.
Most of the students' arguments is mainly because
Oh,
of
thank
their
you.
parents' influence, not wanting to write like their information, their address, and like fearful of like impossible deportation.
You know, 700,000 people have applied for it and over 600,000 have received it. And yes, at a certain point you have to trust, like almost any other kind of relationship. Let me tell you, if you want to go to the bank and get a Subaru, you're going to have to give more information than you have to give here, because you got to give credit worthiness. You don't have to give that for this. You can be broke as can be. It's invasive, and at first I was concerned because they would be known to the government, but I don't see the alternative. The alternative is not getting arrested in the hopes that Congress will say, oh, Jose Lopez Samperio was arrested in McCain's office. Let's give him CIR. That's just not the way that it works. It doesn't work that way, at least not in the universe that I live in. So I don't see the alternatives. It's always relative to what? And getting Social Security numbers and employment authorization and permission to leave the country and come back is pretty good eating. I didn't expect all of that. And you get lawful presence where it stops all kinds of illegality clocks that count against you. And so you then get driver's licenses in most states. You get in-state tuition in virtually all the states. You get all kinds of other benefits that you didn't get when you were out of state, when you were not here legally present. But during that period of time, you are considered legally, lawfully present. That is a big deal. They had not been giving that prior to DACA. So my answer is, okay, don't get it. Just don't speak out against it for those many people who want it, and for the 600,000 who successfully have had it and who've gotten jobs, who've gotten licenses, who've begun teaching, who've begun driving to work, who've begun taking their older parents now to the doctors, because in some states, as you know, even the undocumented parents can get health care. It entitles you to health care in some instances, depending on how generous the state is. But we shouldn't make it entirely contingent upon where you happen to live, where your parents happened to find work years ago. It shouldn't be that. You should have your own independence. And getting in-state tuition, if you haven't gone to school for 3 years in the state of California, to get AB 540, as you know, you don't get it. I know there's some new exceptions that make it 24 months instead of 36, but still, it's a very good deal. I don't know a better deal that's coming down the pike. And I gotta say, I really worry about what's gonna happen after the election. These folks will be safe. I believe that they will still be able to keep it. But what's been a spigot that's been turned on can be turned off. That's my answer to that. Yes?
Hi, so buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
I'm Edna Monroy with CJA, California Immigrant Youth Justice Alliance, and it's pretty good. It feels good to be back, and thank you so much for providing some of your thoughts and all the work that you've been doing as an undocumented immigrant, and really not calling myself a dreamer, but an undocumented immigrant. And having benefited from DACA after waiting for 9 months and just getting it this past April, it's a little worrisome of what you mentioned, and I know, and right, like I'm assuming you're wishing it or you're saying it in a good way, but to be honest, we got DACA not because President Obama just felt good one day and said, you know what, let's give these dreamers, these good kids, America's future, an opportunity to work, right? Like I myself, as an undocumented immigrant, graduated from UCLA, like I had to work 3 jobs to like pay for tuition.
I know there's a question in here somewhere.
Yes.
It's coming, right?
So, yeah, and I just want to say that, and as we keep hearing, we're learning from other movements, not just for the immigrant youth or like immigrant rights movement, but recognizing the Black movement as well. For every how does it go? For every Malcolm X, there needs to be a Martin Luther King and vice versa, right? So in order for us to have gotten DACA, people needed to do sit-ins. People needed to call out the government. We're still calling out Obama because he has the power to stop deportations, and yet he's not doing it. And so I feel that, yes, it's a great opportunity moving forward with DACA, and as you mentioned,
I know
right,
there's
like,
a question coming.
Like go to school and all that, but what can you say to people that feel to a certain extent complacent, that they keep thinking like, well, let me take care of myself, not necessarily getting back into the community? What can you say to people that oftentimes forget how we got DACA, how there's still a lot of work to be done?
There has been, I hope that's not a counter to me, because it's not a thing that I don't agree with. But there have been sit-ins for a long time. I know that every dreamer thinks that sit-ins started with them. like the world just started. If you are DACA, you are not undocumented. If you are DACA, you're not undocumented. And it's important that you be precise in the characterization of your legal status. You are not. If you are here legally present, you are not undocumented. DACA makes you lawfully present, and you've got to act in that capacity, and the discourse has got to change, because otherwise you're no different than Sergio Garcia, who is undocumented because he wasn't eligible. You can't draw that distinction. Number 2, no one's suggesting that you don't continue this action. But the president gave, and government gave, and the government can take away. And I think that now that it's been had, and all of us are grateful for this and proud of the work that was done, but this work was not done by sitting in offices. Undocumented persons and DACA people do not vote. What has moved these people is the fear of political mobilization among voters. And all I'm saying is, every time someone comes out publicly and outs themselves, they put their parents at risk. And so we don't have to agree on everything. Great part of the system is that we don't have to. But I will say this. This came about because a lot of people were in the village advocating, including Professor Hiroshi Motomura here, who wrote the letter that set out DACA, that was followed almost to the letter, with 150 law professors signing along with him. There had been an awful lot of sit-ins and a lot of YouTubes and a lot of flash mobs before that time. When he received that, he acted. And it's because we vote, we go to court, we challenge, but it is completely discretionary. And what is discretionarily given can be discretionarily withheld. That's the only point that I want to end on, because that's the way that it works. And keeping up the pressure is not going to, you think that's going to help a Republican Congress decide to do this? Democrats can't can't deliver this. I don't see how a lame duck Republican Senate is going to do, a lame duck Republican Congress is going to do this. Maybe you've got better insight into the political process than I do. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a lawyer. I go to court. I win much more often than I lose. And I draft, including every single state statute that went. There are 20 of them now that came about because I wrote the first ones. And we wrote them because we knew that some of these things are federal and some are state. And sometimes you have to render unto Caesar. And I think that we've got to be very careful. If all of a sudden we stop getting DACA, then people will be scrambling about what they have to do. And then that's going to be a completely different discourse. And I think it's going to be very, very problematic. And I think they will come after our parents. They go after our parents now with workplace raids. Why would they stop doing that simply because we have DACA? I think it's extremely troubling. And the 400,000 people who are being removed every year are, for the most part, workers, not dreamers. Dreamers aren't being removed. People who are being removed are our parents. And I think we're putting some of them at risk. And they came here and they brought us here at risk, knowing full well that it would improve the lot of their children's lives. And now we have an obligation to do well in school and to work on others' behalf. So I don't urge you to stop the activism. You didn't hear me say that. I'm saying let's do stuff that actually counts, that might work. Some of that may be behind the scenes, not just simply getting arrested and going on YouTube. That just, too much stuff on YouTube these days. Well, you get one last question, yes?
Yes. I appreciate that you raised the issue because it is the foundation of my question. During the last election, there was a lot of rumbling in the Latino communities about immigration reform, and it was spoken of as dreamers versus everybody else in many community-based organizations. It has gone largely ignored, I think, by the dreamers, that some of their activities have fueled the discontent in the older immigrant community, and I get concerned that this will be used in the 2016 election, which will be critical for us. If we get a Democrat, we have a shot of extending DACA and maybe down the road immigration reform. But if we don't, we lose it. We lose it all for another decade or so. What has been your experience in working with this issue when it arises in immigrant advocacy groups that feel at odds with dreamers?
I have a very, what will likely be an unsatisfactory answer. I don't see that. I don't see, and I remember I used to work for LULAC with the oldest immigrant group, and I work with older adults and their students, just in their children, and that's not the contest that I see within the community, like we're placing too much emphasis on the dreamers, because frankly, bringing dreamers along increases our numbers in all likelihood, because when CIR does come, they'll be at the front of the line, as they should be, because they will have all the criteria that are normally required for citizenship or for permanent residence. So I think that's an unalloyed good. There's no bad side to that. My concern is that this narrative has largely been fueled by the innocent children, sojourners discourse, which I think makes it harder for Congress to do anything about children that are new arrivals, because they don't want to, in large part, or about older citizens, or excuse me, older immigrants who are undocumented. They're going to say, look, your children will get it, and then your children can apply for you. Of course, they won't be able to, because these people will not be able to negotiate the bars and, you know, the unauthorized presence of long time here, and they'll be able to prove it. Government will be able to prove it because their kids were here in school, and so they were here. It's a very complex, there are a lot of moving parts here. I don't want to suggest that movement for one comes at the expense of another. That's the problem with the discourse, is that it forces us into an either-or bimodal Manichaean world where there's only one good and one bad. And I think it's much more nuanced than that. We really do admire these parents who came here and brought us their wonderful children, including the children who are in this room. Many of our parents came here to seek better lives for us. We have made it virtually impossible for people to do that legally from certain countries because of the per country limitations, because of the waiting queues, because we make it so hard. I will just end on this note. I'm not for entirely open immigration, but not for a reason that you might think. It's because we have too many undocumented Swedes, and they bring ABBA with them. And that's where I draw the line. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.